Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. Now I get asked a lot, and I have in the past been asked many times to talk more about wavy blades, sometimes known as Flamberge, flame blades, whatever. Let's call them wiggly blades or wavy blades. And I have spoken a little bit about these in the past and pointed out that they are something you find in lots of different cultures. This is one of the most famous examples of a wavy blade. In this case, this is a Moro Kris. Probably dates to about 1900, maybe the early years of the 20th century, and it's from the Philippines, famously used by the Moros. This is one of the most famous examples of wavy blade, but there are many other examples you can find from around the world in different periods. So we've talked about the fact that wavy blades do accentuate cutting capacity to some degree. So obviously there are many different ways of cutting. There is a simple chop. Okay, there is a push cut and there is a pull cut, and you can combine any of those things. So something can be a chop and a push, or it can be a chop and a pull, or slice, some people might call that. So there's various combinations of these, and additionally sometimes you intend to thrust and you miss with the thrust, and that in itself becomes a push cut. But in all of these things, having a wavy blade will make a more effective wound and will cut through meat essentially more effectively. And additionally, with certain types of clothing, certainly thin clothing, perhaps even things like silk, serrated or wavy blades are more likely to get through it. On a simple basis, there are two ways in which having a wavy blade increases cutting capacity. One is that if you're simply striking, you're concentrating the energy, or the force rather, into a smaller area of the blade. So rather than having a long curved or straight blade, it's actually concentrating into smaller nodes and therefore increasing the force at those points. That's one way. Another way, for example, is with a push cut, you've got an undulation effect. So it's a little bit like a saw in that it's going dunk, 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 dunk across the thing that you're slicing across. So it's almost biting into, chewing into the thing that it's going across. And lastly, and it's related to that last point, it's a little bit like having a curved blade. So curved blades, I've talked about the advantages because it reduces the tangent at the angle of the edge geometry. And that can be effective with a forwards curve or a backwards curve. You get slightly different effects. You get more of a chopping effect with a forwards curve and more of a slicing effect with a backwards curve. Essentially, one's more like a push cut and one's more like a draw cut. But when you have a wavy blade, whichever one, whether it's on the back, so in other words, the curve going away from the thing you're striking, or whether it's on the curve going towards the thing you're striking, you're getting one or other of those effects with each of those things. And if you hit straight on the front, it's a bit like a small circular blade, so you're concentrating all the force at one particular point. So in other words, wavy blades do give some of the advantages of curved blades, and they are definitely designed to increase cutting potential, but not always cutting in the same way. Now, very briefly, before I wrap up this video, I want to consider why weren't these more common across history throughout the world? Why weren't wavy blades, if they're more effective at cutting, why weren't they used more commonly? Well, I think that there are two main factors. Number one, it makes carrying or sheathing the blade more difficult. Okay, so generally speaking, you can make a large wooden scabbard that will accommodate this. On something that's around the size of a Moro Kris, it's not too much of a problem. But if you have something that's sword sized, like a rapier or any other type of sword, certainly with the large two-handed swords which don't even have scabbards, having a blade that is wavy like this can be problematic in terms of the scabbard, not only in terms of getting it in and out and housing it, but because of the nature of the wavy blade, it's going to be very difficult to not damage your scabbard every time you pull it out and put it back in. That, I think, is one reason, although not a major one. I think the primary reason is that they are more difficult to make and maintain. A wavy blade takes a huge amount more effort to make. I mean, the amount of effort that's gone into making a fine edge geometry, this is quite sharp, so I'm being quite ginger with the way I'm handling it. The edge geometry on something that's wavy, I mean, getting edge geometry correct on just a straight or a simple curved blade is difficult enough, but getting it right on a blade which is undulating like this is even more difficult. But remember, as well as making the thing, you've got to maintain it as well. So even once you've made the thing, every time this gets any kind of edge damage, you've got to refinish those edges and resharpen those edges, and that's far more difficult with this type of wavy blade. Incidentally, I should mention monochrysses don't always have this number of wiggles. This is a particularly wiggly example. Some examples are straight, some examples just have a gentle undulation, but it does seem that, at least in the Philippines, if we're talking about this specific type of sword, the number of wiggles is related to the status of the owner to some degree, although the jury's out on how true that is or whether that's partly an urban myth. I don't know. If you know things about that, feel free to post underneath. On things like so-called Flamberge two-handed swords, you even find wavy blades on some rapiers. Obviously the considerations are slightly different, but I do think fundamentally it's still about trying to increase the cutting capacity of that weapon, whether it's being used to chop, push or pull, or all of the above. And of course, remember, many of these, in fact all of these weapons, have two edges, so it can be with back cuts as well, not always just forward cuts. I hope that's been interesting to you. I'm sure I will talk more about wavy blades in the future. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!